Hi, we were having technical difficulties at our recent webinar, Young in Love and in Danger. We just missed the beginning of the webinar, and I'm recording this for you now so that you don't miss out on it. So I would like to welcome everyone to the webinar to discuss the young in love and in danger and the intersections with homelessness. I'm Trish, Connolly, the CEO of Yfoundations, which is the peak body for youth homelessness in New South Wales and the only youth homelessness peak body in Australia. I'd like to take this opportunity by acknowledging that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would like to extend that respect to First Nations people on this webinar today. It would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to live with devastating impacts of colonisation, including disproportionate rates of homelessness and domestic and family violence. We had some housekeeping. You probably do not need to know that, but it's people remained on mute. Questions were put in the Q&A function, and those questions were monitored, and most of them were asked and answered. We did actually put in a warning that the material we're discussing today could be triggering or distressing for some people, and we included some support numbers in the chat just in case you need them. We've just sent out an email with those numbers in those as well, so please use them if you're having difficulty with the material. I want to acknowledge that it is the eve of International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. I want to acknowledge the tenacity of all the women who've come before us to bring the issue of domestic and family violence out of the shadows and into the public sphere. To these warriors, we owe you so much. And this is a good segue into introducing two of these amazing women. Dr. Catherine Robinson is an Associate Professor in Housing and Communities in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Tasmania. She is known for her research and advocacy on homelessness and complex trauma. Her recent work includes a focus on the lived experience of waiting for social housing and unaccompanied child homelessness. We are very fortunate to have Catherine here with us today and to provide some reflections about the intersection of teen intimate partner violence with homelessness. Dr. Carmel Hobbs is a researcher at the Social Action and Research Centre, Anglicare, Tasmania. For over 15 years, Carmel has undertaken research across a broad range of sectors, including domestic violence and abuse, educational disengagement, housing, and trauma-informed practice. Anglicare Tasmania launched Dr. Hobbs' new research, Young in Love and in Danger, to a packed audience on Tuesday, and we are extremely fortunate to have her here to present her findings to us today. The number of people who've registered for this webinar is an indication of the interest the community has about this issue. And without any further ado, I will hand it over to Carmel to present her research findings. And that is where the next video will start.
Recommendations at the end. So at SARC, we do research on social justice issues where there's an identified opportunity for change in Tasmania. A few years ago, a team of youth workers from Anglicare approached us with their concerns about the violence and abuse that they were seeing happening amongst the young people that they were working with. They were particularly concerned about the severity of violence that was being inflicted by and on their clients. They were really concerned about the younger people, particularly young men that they were working with, and their attitudes and the kinds of behaviours that they could see, the trajectory that they could see that going on. And they were also really concerned about the young women that they were working with and the abuse that they were enduring in relationships that they were in with young people similar to their age, as well as partners who are much older than them, and often exploiting them in terms of, you know, providing them with housing in order to keep them in these relationships. And these were some of the concerns that these workers had. They were also really frustrated that they had no referral pathways through which to offer their clients additional support. So they were working really hard, as so many of you do, to support young people as best as possible, but with limited training and limited resources and limited referral pathways. It was really, difficult, and this was, one of the reasons that they came to us. So this project is the first of its kind in Tasmania. It's one of few in Australia, and the aims of the project were to understand the prevalence of domestic violence and abuse in teen relationships, understand the nature of that abuse. So what is it like to be in an abusive relationship as a child who is under 18, and also to understand the support and service needs of young people who are under 18. I took a mixed methods approach. Won't go into this in very much detail, but I use mixed methods. I undertook a quantitative analysis of existing statistical data on the prevalence of domestic violence and abuse amongst young people that had been collected via the longitudinal study of Australian children in 2018. And I used qualitative methods to explore the lived experience of young people and professionals. I interviewed 17 young people who are aged 18 to 25 and who had experienced abuse from a partner when they were under 18. And I interviewed 20 professionals working with young people who are under 18 in Tasmania. I recruited young people through housing services, youth services, family violence services, word of mouth and neighbourhood houses, and professionals through similar sorts of services in the housing and education sector, NGOs, and family violence support services. Okay. Just a reminder that some of this content is really dark. It's really horrific. The support services are listed in the chat. If you feel the need to step away and take a break, please do so. I want to start to talk about the relationships that these young people were in. And whilst I interviewed 17 young people, they described to me 27 relationships that they had been in as children when they, as young people who are under 18. Together, those young people shared 61 years of living in violent and abusive relationships as a group. That's, 61 years is, these are children. They're long relationships, they're serious relationships, and we need to remember that. Almost all of the relationships over half started before participants were 16 years old. Almost all of them involved a male identifying abusive partner and female identifying victim survivor. Almost all were 6 months or more in duration. About a third involved significant age gaps ranging from 8 to 22 years. And I think this was a bit of a surprise because there's a bit of an assumption that these relationships would typically involve much older abusive partners, when in fact quite a lot of the relationships, the young people were not that different in age. About 2/3 of partners were under 18 when the relationship started, and almost half of the participants were in 2 or more abusive relationships when they were under 18. So these details are really important. They demonstrate that the relationships of teens are serious. They're not short-term, fickle, or fleeting as they're typically viewed through an adult lens. The details are also important because in Tasmania, legislation recognises relationships as significant for young people once they are 16, and even then it can be difficult to demonstrate significance under the law. And this precludes young people from having access to some kinds of formal protection, including family violence orders. These relationships that young people described, whilst sometimes loving, were also clouded by abusive partners who inflicted short and long-term harm through behaviours that sought to exert control and power over the participants. The findings of the research reveal a number of tactics or behaviours that constitute domestic violence and abuse as experienced by teens. The nature of this abuse is broken into 3 categories for this report, this presentation, and they look at, behaviours and tactics that control what happens to someone's body, what happens to controlling your freedom and choices, and controlling your thoughts and emotions. And whilst the 3 categories of controlling behaviours are presented separately, we have to remember that abusive partners may actually employ them, and often employ them, simultaneously and interchangeably, and that the behaviours may change over time, usually escalating in severity. These partners controlled what happened to the young people's bodies. The participants shared harrowing stories of rape and other sexual abuse, being drugged, and severe physical violence and abuse. One of the most disturbing findings from this research is the severity of violence that young people endured. Several young people described violence involving firearms, knives, cars, garden tools, and choking, all of which put their lives in immediate danger. I'm going to share a couple of quotes with you from some of these young people. Katie described an incident where her partner took his gun bolt out and he had it before my head. He said, "I'll fucking kill you. If you want to die, I'll fucking kill you." All I kind of remember is just sitting on the floor. I had my hands over my ears because I didn't want to listen to him. He left about 4 a.m. He told me not to go anywhere. He locked me in the caravan, and as soon as he left, I waited for his car to go out the gate, and then that was it. I was just packing a bag. I had to break the door handle on the caravan to unlock it and get out. This wasn't the end of that relationship, unfortunately for Katie. She did manage to leave in that moment, but all of the conditions surrounding that relationship meant that she reconnected with him and, remained in that relationship for a number of years. And in fact, said to me as part, while I was talking to her a bit later, she said, that they had reconnected and then they'd moved somewhere else. And then she says, and then it got really bad. So this for her was not even as bad as it got. And that's, really significant. Michelle described an incident. She was in a relationship with a man or a boy who had kept her locked effectively in a small, what would you call it, shed out the back with him where he stayed. And she had managed to escape at one point. He caught her and took her back, and she described this incident where he had a knife and held it to her neck. She said that then he decided to cut her wrist instead, and it was pouring out with blood. And because he thought I was going to run away again or something, he decided, and this is really, 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 really bad, he decided to put a chain around my neck. Similarly, that was not the end of that relationship for Michelle. Jamie talked about the sexual assault that she experienced from her partner, and this is not dissimilar to a number of the experiences that young people shared. She says, "I remember the first time that he did sexually assault me. I wish at that time I had left. I was 14. We hadn't moved into the unit yet, so we were still in the house and it had happened. After he said, 'You'd already said yes before.' At the time, obviously I said no, and I've tried to physically fight. I ended up just getting thrown across the room into a cupboard, and I just lay on the floor there crying until he fell asleep again, and then I climbed onto the bed. At this stage, I didn't have anywhere else to go, so just accepted that that happened and hoped it wouldn't happen again. But obviously it just got worse throughout the years. More often, less severe, but because I stopped fighting." Young people described how their partners stripped them of freedom and choices. Participants described feeling that they were owned or the possession of their abusive partners. A series of rules dictated and dominated everyday life, and they were expected to be passive and submissive. They talked about partners who controlled their phone and their passwords, how they were told what to wear, how to do their makeup, what they could post online, who they could be friends with, and for some young people, what they could eat and what time they should go to bed. They were isolated from friends and family, from school, from work. They were tracked and monitored, their everyday movements under the watchful eye of their abusive partners, and sometimes others who were also recruited to monitor them. Young people found themselves changing their behaviour to minimise the risk that they might face. Elise, for example, remembered how she would take selfies in front of signs and landmarks everywhere she went and kept all of her receipts so that she could prove exactly where she was and at what time. Many of the abusive partners eroded the self-esteem of young people in this study. They described to me some of the most awful acts of humiliation and degradation. Name calling, being spat on, told they were worthless and nobody else would ever love them. Lily told me that her partner used her traumatic sexual assault history against her, using it to further damage her already fragile sense of self-esteem. He told her more than once to go and get raped again, you rape slut. Gaslighting forced young people to question their reality. Their perceptions were twisted, making them unsure if what was happening to them was normal, something they should tolerate, and something that they deserved. Elise said to me, he wouldn't try and hit me, he'd just scream, threaten to shoot me, threaten to do all this stuff, but he wouldn't physically punch me in the face. So, that's what he'd say. I'm not abusive to you, it's all in your head, you deserve this. So I truly believed at that point in time that I deserved it. Participants also described having a deep-seated sense of fear. This was the result not only of the physical and sexual violence that they endured, but the threats of violence that were sometimes explicit and sometimes very subtle. Gina, for example, talked about her partner doing things like gripping a knife really tightly while they were sitting at the dinner table, so she could see and she knew what it meant, but anybody around them would be unlikely to notice. It was also very common for partners to use threats of suicide to manipulate the young people in this study into doing things against their will, including staying in the relationship. We need to understand that these actions are not one-off incidents. They represent a pattern of behaviours that are used to gain and maintain control over another person. They were effective. The young people who were part of this project were afraid. They were alone. They were in danger. And the violence and abuse they endured felt inescapable and unavoidable. These young people were trapped not only by the behaviours of their abusive partners, but also by conditions that are external to the relationship. Young people and professionals talked about cultural norms and values that glorify and condone violence and abuse. Where young people have been in violent, intimate partner relationships and also abused by people other than their partners, these two conditions combine in a powerful force, and it sends a message that what has happened to them is normal and to be expected. This is further reinforced by a lack of support services and limited, if any, conversation about domestic violence and abuse in school and around the community. This gap tells young people that it is not a big enough or significant enough problem to warrant a response, further reinforcing the normalisation and condoning of violence and abuse. In some cases, young people are also trapped by limited experience and understanding of healthy relationships. Simply the fact that they have had not many, if any, relationships of their own, and they're learning as they go, can make recognising the signs of abuse and distinguishing them from the early stages of a relationship really difficult to do. To these young people, their relationships were serious. Some of them described being in love and thought that this was the one, and that they wouldn't find someone else who would love them. Some of the young people in this study also talked about an absence of loving and caring figures, often fathers, in their lives, and how these relationships in some ways filled that gap. Jamie said to me, I had no father figure, so even though he, her partner, had been abusive and honestly terrible, he probably gave me still the most love in those adolescent years than anyone. So even though it was coming from a terrible place, it felt good. Many of the participants were dependent on their abusive partner and sometimes their family for housing. With little or no income, inadequate access to Centrelink and limited access to affordable housing, these teens were faced with homelessness if they'd left the relationship. In some cases, the relationships that they built with their partner's family also posed as a barrier to leaving, because leaving meant risking losing some positive connections and the sense of belonging that they had developed with others. Jess talked to me about an incident where her and her sister, this was not her relationship with her partner, it was related to her family, but still was instrumental in how she pursued or didn't pursue, to be more accurate, support services in the future. So there had been a huge incident with her father in their home, and this had been happening for a long time, but this particular incident prompted her and her sister to go and get help. And she said to me and my sister, we thought it was so bad at home that we went to Centrelink to talk to them about domestic violence and abuse that we were experiencing at home. And do you know what they did? They turned us away. They didn't want to hear anything about it. I asked her, why Centrelink? And she said, well, we didn't know where else to go, honestly. There was no information, especially at school, about domestic abuse in a household. Like, we were never taught about anything like that, where to go if you're experiencing domestic abuse. And we just thought, well, the only place that we can go is Centrelink, because I know they can help with housing and emergency money and stuff. We were quite young. We just went back home and lived there for another 3 years, and it put us off asking for help anywhere. Like, we just didn't even bother about it anymore. These relationships, as many of you know, have devastating consequences for victim survivors during and after the relationship have ended. They're not just bad breakups that you get over. Earlier, I mentioned how the lives of young people are in immediate danger from the actions of their violent and abusive partners. This is not the only risk to life that they face. More than half of the participants disclosed suicide attempts they attributed directly to these relationships. And of the 17 young people that I talked to, 14 had attempted suicide and or had their lives endangered by a partner. The young people live with immediate and long-term detrimental mental, physical, and sexual health and well-being impacts from these relationships. They suffer with daily reminders of their abuse in the form of scars, pain, physical disfigurement, and mental health conditions, including eating disorders and complex PTSD. Alcohol and other drugs have been used as a coping strategy and can continue to have consequences for their health long into the future. For young women who were pregnant during these relationships, the magnification of trauma resulting from abortions, miscarriages, and for some having to maintain contact with abusive partners where they had a child together plagues their healing and their recovery process. These young people were also transitioning from children to adults while enduring violence and abuse from their partners. They described how this affected their identity, their self-worth, their relational skills and relationships, including their ability to develop and maintain relationships with new partners, family, and friends. The risk of future victimization for these young people is high. They were also aware of the implications these relationships had on their future housing, education, and employment opportunities. As a result of these relationships, some participants had criminal records. Some struggle with daily living skills, like managing money and maintaining a routine. It's important to remember that these impacts are experienced differently by individuals. But in short, all participants suffered from and continue to endure lasting negative impacts from these relationships, some of which may stay with them for their whole lives and may flow onto other outcomes that they are yet to face. This report also includes the voices of 20 professionals who together shared 243 years of experience working with young people. They confirmed what young people had said and described those experiences as resonating with their own observations of young people in Tasmania. Their perception was that prevalence was high, with professionals working with young people in shelters and youth support services suggesting that most, if not all, of their clients were or had at some point been in an abusive relationship. As part of this project, I analysed data from the longitudinal study of Australian children and found that approximately 40% of 18 to 19-year-olds in Tasmania are likely to report experiencing violence and abuse in their relationship in the last 12 months. This figure is staggering and worse than the national figure of 28.5%, which itself is disturbing. Adding to what young people shared, workers expressed grave concerns about the severity of violence, their observations of young men and boys having skewed views of love and relationships, and the stark absence of policies, services, and appropriate training for people working with teens. They also expressed fear about the trajectory and escalation of young people's relationships and behaviours and likelihood of future victimisation. Matilda said, they're going to end up dying. It might not be when they're 18, but it probably is when they're 30, from the next man and the next violent relationship that they're in. The normalisation of and exposure to violence and abuse pose significant challenges for workers. The need for comprehensive initiatives addressing norms and values was deemed crucial. Young people need to hear these messages and be exposed to reliable, safe, and loving adults on a regular basis. Workers also felt strongly about the need for direct and honest communication with teens about violence and abuse, suggesting that current strategies may be shame-inducing for young people who are experiencing this in their lives. We need to listen and we need to respond. It's really remarkable to see how many people are here today, how many people came to the launch on Tuesday, the media coverage that we have had. And in many ways, this interest really mirrors the eagerness of young people, that the eagerness that they had for participating in this project. It was both sad and helpful for the research that it wasn't difficult at all for me to find young people who wanted to share their stories. They were willing to delve into deeply traumatic histories because they felt it was so important to share that story and for people to listen and to know what is happening. We know that teen domestic violence and abuse is experienced by people of all genders, of all ages, of all socioeconomic groups. There is no school, no service, and no community untouched by this. In the past few years, we have all witnessed what can happen when we're faced with a significant public health issue. COVID-19 has shown us what is possible when governments, NGOs, research institutes, and the community band together. We saw new policies, new practices, investment in trained professionals, community-based initiatives and statewide campaigns, prevention, response, and recovery. It's time for us to bring teen domestic violence and abuse out of the shadows. There's no denying that it's happening and that it's horrific. The response to this research so far makes it clear that people care, and this gives me hope. It gives me hope because when I ask young people and workers what they thought was needed, people who care, and that includes all of you, was one of 5 specific needs that was identified. They also called for education about domestic violence and abuse that is direct and allows young people to talk about this issue openly in a safe environment. They called for specialist services for young people who are experiencing teen domestic violence and abuse that are developmentally sensitive and meet the unique needs of young people. They also called for protection to be provided by formal services, including police and child safety, and legislation that ensures protection can be provided to all victim survivors. Finally, they also wanted safe, affordable, and secure housing and appropriate material resources for children who are escaping domestic violence and abuse. This is where the recommendations come in. Preventing and responding to this issue requires a coordinated, multi-sector response that addresses the 7 recommendations emerging from this research. They are all essential. No one or 2 can be singled out. And the strength of these recommendations is that there is something in there for everyone. 7 recommendations, all with suggested actions that collectively apply to all sectors, to us as professionals, and as Australian citizens who care. I want to say thank you to you all for being here and being part of this conversation. You've had a glimpse into some of the stories of young people today. The report provides many more, and I encourage you to honour the time and the courage of the young people who participated in this project and read the full report. Listen to what they are telling us about their experiences and what they say is needed. Read the recommendations and the actions and locate your place in the solution. Let's together put an end to this harrowing and preventable issue.
Thank you so much, Carmel. I don't think I'm the only person that's on this webinar today that is so grateful that you have delved into this issue that has up until now been absent in the conversation, in the policy, quite absent. I know the content is really difficult, but it is so powerful from what we've just heard, what you presented today. And the research really delves into an issue that Yfoundations is and has strongly advocated for, is the absence of unaccompanied children and young people in the conversation, the policies and the strategies that focus on domestic and family violence and the intersection with homelessness. I don't think we can ignore the threat of homelessness and what it played in the decisions of these young people, which placed them in violent and often life-threatening circumstances. And I think this speaks volumes about the threat of homelessness. We will bear almost anything to avoid it. And now I'm going to get Dr. Catherine Robinson, who is a leading researcher and advocate on unaccompanied child homelessness. who will reflect on the ramifications of Carmel's research for this cohort. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Trish and the Yfoundations team for hosting the webinar today. And thank you, Carmel, for your systematic, thorough and skillfully compassionate research. And thanks to all of you in this large audience who are taking the time to engage with us on this one of the defining issues of our times. I'm here in beautiful Lutruwita, Tasmania, on the unceded lands of the Muwinina people in Hobart. And I acknowledge that my family and I are beneficiaries of the past and present First Nations custodianship of these lands. I acknowledge all First Nations elders past, present and emerging, and the proud and strong Tasmanian Aboriginal community. My contribution to today's webinar is to provide just a very brief set of reflections in response to the research findings that Carmel has so powerfully outlined for us. What Carmel has described is the frighteningly common experience of teen intimate partner violence. The violence she discussed is violence that we associate with the adult world. Vicious, planned, weaponised. But the group living it, and in some cases perpetrating it, are those under 18, children by legislation. I listened to her research as a mother of teens and children aged 8, 11 and 14, and I feel rage and overwhelmed at the thought of victimisation or perpetration of violence as a possibility in their lives. The response to Carmel's work that I'm giving today is not rooted in their childhoods though, or in those of teens who experience intimate partner violence in their relationships, but who eventually may have some kind of access to the safety, resources and advocacy of their family or school or other supportive community members. Instead, I'm thinking about Carmel's research in the context of homelessness experienced by children under 18 who are alone, not accompanied by a parent or guardian. So the response I'm offering is not from my perspective as a mother of teens and children, but from my perspective as a researcher and advocate on unaccompanied child homelessness. And yes, this is to add a whole new layer of complexity to the already complex issue of teen intimate partner violence. The crux of my reflections is around the relationship between homelessness and teen intimate partner violence for children who are unaccompanied. Unaccompanied child homelessness is a context which involves a child beginning to exit their family home, often between age 10 and 13, not in the custody of a parent or guardian. This could involve children alone, sleeping rough, couch surfing with neighbours, school friends, boyfriends and girlfriends, swapping sex or criminal activity for shelter and other material resources, accessing a youth refuge if they know about them, if there is one in their region, if they are old enough, if there's a bed. The key issues here are the lack of access to effective guardianship, potentially a lack of access to money due to young age, difficulty accessing school, a lack of access to stable care and accommodation, a lack of access to medical and mental health care, and extreme vulnerability, fear, and loneliness. Further, we know family breakdown is the main driver of unaccompanied child homelessness. Family breakdown results in the reduction or loss of effective guardianship and the reduction or lack of access to a family home. In my research, also undertaken for Anglicare Tasmania, exposure to caregiver intimate partner violence and physical and sexual abuse all feature as central drivers of unaccompanied child homelessness. But intimate partner violence and sexual and physical victimisation are also core to unaccompanied children's pathways through homelessness. That is, they may experience early childhood adversity, leave or escape their family homes, and then come into adolescent experiences of homelessness in which intimate partner violence and sexual and physical victimisation again feature. The kinds of experiences of teen intimate partner violence that Carmel has described are happening to unaccompanied homeless girls in particular. And tragically, this makes sense for all the issues described. These are girls alone with no or limited access to independent income, with no or limited access to guardianship, with no or limited access to care and accommodation, and in some cases with lifetime experiences of cumulative trauma. This sets up a perfect storm for repeated exposure to and practical entrapment within violent intimate relationships. Where a violent intimate relationship becomes a key survival resource for an unaccompanied child, you know, as a society, there is something really wrong and really missing in how and where we are targeting care and support. Where other sources of care, protection and guardianship and accommodation are not in place, what are the choices of an unaccompanied homeless adolescent if they're in fact reliant on an often older partner who can provide accommodation in their parents' home or indeed in their own independent housing? The failure of the state to provide adequate, safe, age-appropriate care and accommodation options simply mirrors and reinforces entrapment by perpetrators. This is to add a form of intimate, systemic violence to intimate partner violence. So highlighted here is what is unique about child and teen intimate partner violence. Many children and teens are not reliant on their intimate partner for housing because they might live separately in a family home. And there's an increased likelihood that eventually they may have access to the resources of parents and guardians. As Carmel's made very clear, this certainly does not guarantee their safety, of course, but it's something. For unaccompanied children and teens who are without effective guardianship or age-appropriate care and with wholly limited income and housing options, the situation is gravely different. If an unaccompanied homeless child experiences intimate partner violence, where do they escape to? How do they escape? We clearly need child and youth specialist DV services urgently for those children experiencing and perpetrating intimate partner violence in their relationships right now. We need to catch up with the adult reality of child and intimate teen relationships and the intensity of adult violence that is perpetrated within these. For unaccompanied children and teens, the reality at the moment is that it is the specialist homeless service sector which commonly provides DV support, direct DV support. SHS services provide residential DV prevention through supporting and accommodating unaccompanied children and teens at high risk of having to rely on relationships that are violent. It's also the specialist homeless sector that provides a residential DV response to unaccompanied children and teens through supporting and accommodating them in the context of escaping both caregiver intimate partner violence, and their own intimate partner violence. That is a big ask. So whilst the grief, harm and brutality experienced by teens is immense, so are the opportunities to intervene. Preventing and responding to unaccompanied child and teen homelessness will in turn reduce their risk of experiencing entrapment in violent child and teen intimate relationships. Injecting additional DV specialist skills and knowledge into the child and youth homelessness sector would harness and strengthen the DV response already being delivered there. But ultimately, just as the DV sector has argued for the vital and life-saving focus of its services on women escaping domestic violence, not homelessness, we need to think through the appropriateness of child and youth homelessness services for children and youth who are escaping intimate partner violence, especially given the mixed gender of many child and youth homelessness services. Let me end by saying, however, that confronting how to draw together the enormous skill and passion from across the homelessness and DV sectors to improve the wellbeing of teens is a good problem to face. It means teen intimate partner violence is out of the shadows, and that the skill of the DV sector can urgently be brought to bear more directly on the lives of unaccompanied homeless children and teens who are at such increased risk of cumulative intimate partner violence, both in caregivers' homes and in the context of surviving homelessness alone. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And, you know, I'm always so grateful that you are here in this sector and bringing these issues to the fore in such a powerful way that you always talk about them. We can't talk about this issue and the research without talking about the intersections of homelessness. And one thing that struck me this week when we had conversations was the research was able to identify that the violence was more severe for those children or teens who were homeless, and that vulnerability has made them more susceptible to potential homicide. And I just, as a society, this is not okay. We have to do something about this and bring it out. But bearing that in mind, I'm going to start asking some questions, and there's some questions in the chat as well. And please start asking questions, people on line, and we'll hopefully get to them. But bearing what I've just said in mind is that young people don't see themselves as survivors or victims of domestic and family violence. But the absence of the refuges and the specialist youth domestic and family violence support, it strengthens this belief, and that was brought out in the report as well. I was struck by something that one of the participants said. It was so true that if you're under 18, it's not really seen as intimate partner violence. So my question is to both of you, how do we change this mindset among policymakers, politicians, and the general community? Carmel?
It's a good question, and it's absolutely true that it is a perception that it happens to adults and not to younger people, and that, you know, sits in the minds of young people and workers, and as you said, policymakers and those who've got power for decision making. And I think the first thing that we need to do is recognize that the relationships of teenagers are serious and they are significant. I think that's step one, is we have to respect that these relationships are meaningful and they're not, you know, they're not short term, they're not insignificant. And then we need to bring in the conversation that not only are these relationships significant and serious, but violence and abuse is happening in them, and that is also serious and significant.
Catherine?
Well, I think Carmel's nailed it.
Okay. So, all right, I've got a heap of questions here. So we have an opportunity to intervene early and prevent our children and young people from a lifetime of abuse and violence if we invest in their future. In your opinions, where do you think that investment would be best spent?
I think this is a difficult question to answer because there's such an absence of responses across the board and recognition that this is happening. There's opportunity everywhere for investing in, prevention and response activities. But certainly, if we're talking, for example, about education, the participants in this research, when they talked about education, not only did they talk about the importance of it being direct and explicit and naming this up as an issue, but also talked about how important it is to start it as early as we possibly can.
And that would be your number one investment. If you were given a bucket of money, the investment would be in prevention. Carmel? It's tricky, isn't it?
I'm going to stick to my first point and say it needs to happen across the board.
Yeah.
You can't single one out. And it would be really irresponsible to have all this education for young people and at the same time not have services to refer them to. You can't do that.
Absolutely. And historically, there's been a real focus on the prevention activity, hasn't there? But in terms of like the crisis point, there's historically, we don't have those interventions. Someone has asked the question in the chat, and I'm going to sort of lead in with what's in your research. And it identifies 12 and 13-year-olds. And we know legislatively they should be picked up by child protection services or out-of-home care. But in practice, we know this doesn't happen. We know that those services are overwhelmed trying to respond to younger children, and this cohort is not their priority. And in some circumstances are seen as they can look after themselves a lot more effectively than, say, a 5-year-old, and that's their priority. We also know they're too young for domestic and family violence services as well. So the question is, someone has asked, does DCJ respond to pick up to protect these children? And that's our child protection agency here. In your view, in your research, you did find that this didn't happen, didn't you, Carmel?
Yeah.
Yeah. Catherine, did you have anything you wanted to talk about there?
Yeah, look, I think it's a well kind of talked about issue, the kind of interpretation of lower risk for older children. But, what we actually know is that there's a kind of peak vulnerability that happens for children, between 10 and 13, when suddenly they do have capacity to remove themselves from violence. But that is also, so on one hand, that may be seen as a kind of self-protective capacity, but that is the very capacity that then leads them into a whole realm of additional and intense vulnerability, entering into intimate partner violence being one of those, but, all manner of other risks. So I would say that, of course, in every state and territory, there's a key role for child safety services to be playing here to identify sort of early risks for children, but also to identify where they're experiencing active harm. Of course, there's a role to respond. But yes, in practice, we know that children are not always able to receive a response. And so what are the alternatives? And that's really the question that my research asks for those children who don't receive a child protection response and are also not able to access the care from their home environment for whatever complex reasons. What on earth is in place for them?
And that really came out in the research, that you just felt helpless, I think, reading it, that these young people couldn't get the help that they needed when they really needed that help, either being in the family, in a violent situation within the family home or within their own intimate partner violence. It was really difficult. I found that the most difficult aspect of the research to read. There's a number of questions coming in. I'm going to ask both of you, and I don't think this was in your research, Carmel, I certainly don't remember, but what impact do you think the prevalence and availability of pornographic material has on the way young men view sex, intimacy and relationship, and therefore the violence we are seeing?
I'm going to steer away from answering that really directly because it wasn't something that was a focus of this research, but certainly there were some young people who talked about, you know, their partners watching porn in front of them, kind of exposing them, like, you know, that being forced to have to watch it as an issue. And, you know, I guess just the expectations around sex and the kind of sexual violence that these young people experienced, you know, occurred across a spectrum from quite subtle guilt manipulation kind of behaviors through to really explicit, you know, physical force that happened. But the relationship between that and exposure to porn wasn't something that we unpacked.
Yeah, I didn't remember that in the report, but thank you for having a crack at answering that though. There's a lot of questions that are coming through on education, early intervention, and people are wondering if there's any early intervention and educational programs currently being conducted at schools, starting at primary school grades.
Yeah, so in Tasmania, we have a fairly comprehensive respectful relationships education program. I would suggest that and, you know, across the board nationally, this issue of teen domestic violence needs to be inserted into that national curriculum for people to have access to. But yes, the program that we have here in Tasmania that's not yet mandatory does start as early as our early childhood years in school. So that's picking up on themes around, you know, respect and friendships and bullying and those kinds of things, which is great, but we certainly it needs some reworking to get this as an issue in there, you know, as young people are getting older. But, you know, and we need it to be mandatory. We need all schools, not just government schools, but all schools to have access to this material and all children to be exposed to this material.
Do you think it needs to be a lot more hard hitting though? Like, because a number of your participants said if they actually knew what they were, the situation that they were in, and they'd actually been taught that it was not okay, the severity of it, they might have had a different mindset and they might have left early. And there was some of the early intervention and prevention educational programs that were using metaphors like dolphins and sharks, and they were like, you know, they were like, that doesn't work for me. Yeah. So does it need to be rewritten? Does it need to be redesigned, or are they effective, the prevention and early intervention programs? And I'll ask another thing as well. Should they be progressed to be more explicit as the years go on? So primary school, there's a particular kind of style of prevention and early intervention, and it becomes a lot more explicit as they get older so that they can actually tackle these violent, you know, intimate partner violent relationships. Sorry, that was a lot of questions in one thing.
And the short answer to that question is, I think, yes. You know, of course, it needs to be done really sensitively and carefully, but absolutely what the young people and the workers who I talked to said was that, you know, let's be real about it and let's be direct about it and talk about it for what it really is. You know, what are the red flags? How bad can it get? And that was certainly, you know, an unexpected, I suppose, response. I wasn't, you know, seeking to unpack that with young people specifically, but certainly a lot of them talked about, you know, kind of feeling a little bit condescending and patronizing when we're using these euphemisms and making assumptions that young people actually can't have these conversations or don't, you know, that they're not ready for it or whatever it might be. And that, you know, the flip side of that is it creates a problem for young people who are experiencing or using violence and abuse in their relationships when, if this isn't being talked about, it's very easy. And some of the young people said this was, you know, you're kind of sitting there going, well, this is what's happening to me. And everyone's saying that, you know, this is what relationships should look like, but that's not what it looks like for me. And no one's saying anything else. So maybe it's just me. Maybe it's happening to everyone else and I just can't cope with it. Maybe, I don't know, like it's just this gap that's there that kind of tells you, and you can't talk about it. It makes it really difficult to say, hang on a minute, but my experience is this, or I've seen this, or this is happening to my friend. And so the absence of that direct conversation with young people, it does create some problems.
And
can I just jump in and add there that in my recent work with unaccompanied homeless children that focused on their experiences of mental ill health, what really came out also in relation to their experiences of intimate partner violence was this complete mismatch, not just in terms of the delivery or not of specialist DV services, but right across the adolescent service system. There was a mismatch between the extremity of what children were experiencing in terms of that level of violence, and related to that, the intensity of mental illness and ill health that they were also experiencing. The system did not match. It could not meet children in that extremity of experience and distress. And so children and young people participating in my work, talked about, I went to see the school counsellor. I was talking about, sexual assault, and, the response is kind of mindfulness activities or even colouring in. So that it's like the adolescent system has not grown up with this contemporary generation of adolescents. It is not across the level of violence and that intensity of mental ill health that's also resulting for those kids.
It brings to mind something that's in your research, Carmel, where that young person went to her teacher to tell her that she was experiencing this sort of quite severe violence, and the teacher taught her how to meditate. I think she was. Yeah, it was a great quote from her. I think it was like, breathing ain't going to cut it, or something like that.
It was like, deep breaths aren't going to help me do shit, babe.
Yeah, that's it. Got it.
I need someone to actually help me practically.
Yeah. And again, very frustrating when you read those passages within your research that these people, young people, are calling out for help and they get that sort of advice. It's really difficult to read. We are getting a number of questions in, and I'm really glad someone asked this, because we have discussed this before, Carmel and Catherine, about, do you think being in a low socioeconomic environment makes these young people more vulnerable? And they were wondering that so they can have a targeted program. And yes, and thank you, Alice, for putting that in. But we did discuss this yesterday, and we were talking about that concept that people use, that homelessness can happen to everyone, and it actually can't. And are these young people, is it more complex? And that's consistent with the ones that are experiencing homelessness. The violence is more severe. So the question is, does that low socioeconomic environment make them more vulnerable?
You go, Catherine.
Well, I mean, I guess that was really the key point that I was making and what I was talking about. So, if we consider, the poverty and lack of access to material resources that children may experience once they've left a family home, there is a direct correlation to that material vulnerability and how the way in which they may travel into subsequent experiences of physical and sexual victimisation. And that's why it's really important to think about the point that, if there's not, adequate state intervention, then that is a context which is actually setting up children for additional cumulative trauma. So there's a clear moment there where this kind of pathway could be stopped.
Thanks, Catherine. There's another question here about how do we make the perpetrators in teen relationships more accountable? Are the young people you spoke to in your research, Carmel, willing to talk to the police about the abuse?
Yeah, interesting question. Rarely is the case. Occasionally, police were involved, and that was typically when that physical violence was life-threatening. But some of the challenges in terms of contacting police are varied and include, exposure to police responses as children, where there might have been family violence in the home, and how effective or ineffective that may have been. But also here, what I heard from a number of the participants were kind of cultural attitudes around police and a bit of tension between young people and police, or particular communities and police, where calling the police is just not something that you do. And so for some of these young people, where they were just desperately in fear of their lives, even then it was sometimes very difficult, and they would get somebody else to do it. So, they would get a friend or a neighbour, call the police for me. I can't do it. I can't be the one who's seen to have been calling the police. And, that has implications for lots of people. If these young women and boys sometimes, are engaging in drug use, for example, involving police, there is a fear there that there may be implications for them in terms of, backfire, I suppose. And that creates more questions around our legislation around, the criminalisation of drugs and that kind of thing, and how that actually intersects with some of this stuff. But also for some of the partners of these young people who were involved in other criminal activity, it's possible that you're then creating likelihood that that person will be charged with other criminal offences, and the backlash on you for that happening, if that was to occur, or the partner's family or friends or whatever it might be. Like there's more complication to it than just, do they know to call the police or do they want to call the police? Like there are factors in that decision making that make it difficult, in addition to being scared of what the police might do. Will this be effective? What might happen? Am I going to have to go to court? Like all of that stuff. There needs to be a lot of work done, I think, around that with young people.
Yeah, just a layer of entrapment.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, is it also the case, though, Carmel, that police are hamstrung? There are legislative limits in how they can actually respond, particularly to children who are under 16.
Yeah, so here we know that children who are under 16, because of the legislation, they cannot get a family violence order because your relationship cannot be recognised as significant. And so that means that typically if police are involved and it comes to a point where charges are laid, the charges will be for physical assault and not family violence. And that's, I think, where that quote that you mentioned earlier, Trish, came in about people saying, young people don't see this as serious until you turn 18. Because a lot of these young men who were clients of people who I had talked to, the perception of those workers was that some of these young men kind of were like, well, until it's not a big deal until I turn 18. That's when you go to jail for it.
Yeah, wow. I'm going to jump into something else, and this is a question about there's a lot of similarities between the participants in your research, their experience of that of adult who experience intimate partner violence. But what are the striking differences? And I think I want to ask this about, how do we design a service system that responds that's effective? Because there really isn't anything there for this cohort, and they're sort of, if they are accessing services, it's generally youth homelessness services. But how do we make sure that there is a breadth of services? Is it domestic? Do we design something that is specifically domestic and family violence, youth appropriate, age appropriate services for them? Or do we keep the system we have now and beef that up and make it more effective?
Yeah, it's a good point. So to your first question, there's a number of differences between children and adults, I think. Two that stand out the most for me, I suppose, is the vulnerability of these young people in terms of their access to income, access to housing. They're under 18, they can't drive, they don't have cars, they have less access to, mobile phones and credit and, these kinds of things that are just somewhat more complicated for under 18s than of course these things still exist for adults, but I think that it's amplified when you're younger. And then the other piece that is important for us to remember is that they are adolescents, they're transitioning from children to adults, and that's a key developmental phase, and the impacts of these relationships that they have on that developmental transition for young people as they get older is huge and is different to adults, where we already kind of have our identity and who we are in the world. And of course that changes for some people with domestic violence that we experience, but at that developmental stage, it's really powerful. And some of the young people did talk about that, you know, being now between 18 and 25, they could look back and say, you know, he changed the way that I thought, he changed the way that I saw the world, he changed, you know, one girl talked about, you know, I sometimes catch myself saying things that he would say or doing things that he would do, and I hate myself for it because I hated him, but he was, you know, she was so isolated and spent all of her time with him that that influence of his her exposure to him and the way that he operated is incredibly powerful, and yeah, it does have long-reaching impacts. And I think that's why we also really need to think about these services for young people, as well as services for adults who have experienced this as children, and what that means for supporting their healing and their recovery. When we're thinking about providing services to young people, I don't know exactly what the answer there is, but it was very clear that what we need are support services that address this issue for young people and that are designed with the needs of young people in mind. So we know that young people don't engage with services in the same way that adults do. You know, these young people, you know, there's an expectation, I suppose, that they will pick up a phone, make this phone call, make an appointment to go and sit in someone's office for an hour, turn up to that appointment. If they don't, then, you know, eventually they get kind of cancelled and pushed out of the system. We need a very different way of engaging with young people for this stuff. It has to be flexible. You know, there has to be outreach. There has to be that kind of side-by-side work, not that, you know, that difficult kind of awkward meeting type thing that is, you know, hard at any level, let alone when you're young and trying to disclose and get support for something that's happening to you. So I think those, you know, and that is in the report. Workers in particular talked about the characteristics of a service that they have found effective for working with young people, and how that is not necessarily mirrored in adult service design.
And there's rarely any resources that are targeted to that those youth services or those youth homelessness services to be able to be more effective in that space. Like they're great and they do pick up these young people in their services, but there's never really quite attracts the resources and the attention that they need. Bearing that in mind, I'm going to ask you, Alice, to share a presentation. I just want to run through this for the last bit, just to talk about what I was just talking about there. And I want to talk about the National Domestic Family and Sexual Violence Plan. It was great to see children and young people there in their own right, but I would like to see that defined, because historically we use the language children and young people in their own right to get that assessment and that case plan developed in their own right when they come in with their caregivers. So it's not about unaccompanied children. And I think we'd like to see that language of unaccompanied children in the domestic and family violence plan rather than in their own right, perhaps. I felt like, and if you do look at the plan, I do feel like the inclusion of children and young people in their own right was an afterthought. The narrative is missing. They feels like they were slotted into particular places. There's no conversation in there. And I'm going to talk about it later. They're missing in very critical pieces of the plan. It's still dominated, the plan, by the language of women and their children, and children and young people being an extension of their mothers and caregivers. And I am in no way undermining those cohorts. What I'm saying is I feel like the plan could have gone a lot further to have more of a conversation about children and young people who are unaccompanied. Next slide, Alice. I think this is key to what I've just said. I think it really supports what I've just said. This is from the plan, and you see the different, this is one of the pages, the difference. Where are teens in this diagram? You've got the children, you've got adulthood, and you've got older age. They're completely missing in this diagram. And I think that is a really important issue. And I also, it's a huge gap. So I would hopefully we see this change going forward in the action plans. We need teens within there, and this research just supports that. Next slide, Alice, please. I've already said this. There's going to be some action plans going forward. They're probably going to be developed, I think, in early 2023, so next year. But we need a commitment. We need children and young people who are unaccompanied, victim survivors in their own right, must be clearly embedded in this action plan. We also need lived experience embedded in the action plan, and the voices of young people are missing from the decisions. I picked some of that up from the call, the public statement that Kate Fitzgibbons made and others, Shauna Moore, and ending gender-based violence. And this was in their response to the national plan. Next slide, Alice. I just want to reiterate 3 of the things that Carmel's research did identify, and this is possibly something that we could be thinking about going forward, that the Commonwealth Government could be thinking about in the national plan, is we need specialist support and programs for teen victim survivors, and we've talked about that a lot today already. We also need those programs for young people using violence and abuse in their own relationships, and we need a supported and highly trained workforce. I think if we can nail that, there's so many things and activities that do sit under that, but I feel like if we can nail those 3 things, we'll go a long way to responding to this issue. Thank you, that's my slides. I'll just check if there's any more questions.
Trish, can I just jump in and say that, you know, the other key opportunity here is the development of the National Housing and Homelessness Plan, and raising questions about what it is that the child and youth homelessness sector need to provide, and how well they're currently positioned to do that. So in our state of Tasmania, it's most common for youth specialist homeless services to have a one-worker model. So when you look at the scale of violence that you know, clients in those services could be expected to have, the capacity for a single worker to be providing adequate, targeted and you know, trauma-informed and DV specialist care, it's not there. Of course, you know, staff are throwing everything at it, but you know, the opportunity is to think about how do we make sure our services match the actual need that children and young people are presenting with.
I think that's a really good point, Catherine, too. Like, where do we sit with this issue in the domestic and family violence plan, in the national homelessness plan, and where can it sit? And it's that sort of straddling with homelessness and domestic and family violence. And as you know, you and I have been, you know, working quite hard in terms of calling out for a standalone child and youth homelessness strategy. And this is one of our campaigns we will have going forward, because children and young people unaccompanied, and I'll use that word again, consistently are absent, not absent, but they have very limited responses. It'll be a lot of, you know, early intervention prevention, which is great. There'll be some reconnect, and there might be a FOIA model, but it doesn't respond to this breadth of issues, particularly this one, and couch surfing and the implications that come from couch surfing and living in severe overcrowding. So we really need a standalone child and youth homelessness strategy going forward as well. I'm just checking. I think that's it for the questions so far. Okay, is there any more questions?
I think just to add, while you're looking for more questions there, I'll make the most of the minutes, you know. Like, the key there is that actually preventing and responding well to child and youth homelessness will directly reduce the experience of teen intimate violence also, because the overall vulnerability, we could expect that given the overall vulnerability of children and young people is being reduced because they've got somewhere safe, they're not having that dependence on potentially unsafe relationships. But for that to happen, the child and youth homelessness sector needs to be adequately resourced. There need to be supports around workforce development and so on to do that work. But as I raised in my comments, there's also a question here about what is the role that the domestic violence sector is going to play in these kids' lives? Will it develop child and youth specific services? And how could those be coordinated with homelessness services? It'd be great to imagine a kind of referral pathway where children and young people presenting to homelessness services but who are indeed escaping intimate partner violence could be referred to those services that do have that really specialist knowledge and appropriate secure services that may well be needed to provide proper safety, and single sex services that again would respect the needs of those who've experienced violence, to kind of feel safe. So there is a specialist response that needs to be on the table that the homelessness sector is simply not able to provide. So the question is, how do we coordinate services? Who is going to step forward? And we've got this unique opportunity with a national housing and homelessness plan, as well as the DV plan as well. It's a great time to be having this conversation.
Yeah.
Sorry, Catherine, and just say some of the participants also talked about the importance of, like that value of those long-term relationships between clinicians and young people and how important and powerful they are, which is difficult to do in different sectors, but just so critical to, the support that young people can access, as well as a kind of a case management approach. And I think that's where thinking about how services can coordinate is also really important, that, young people aren't going to one place for their housing and one place for domestic violence and one place for, mental health and one place for AOD, that there's, supports for them that help them kind of navigate that system and get to the different places that they need to go. And, we put a lot of pressure and expectation on young people to do that for themselves when what they're coping with on a day-to-day basis is already beyond what we often, understand.
I mean, it just goes back to that sort of designing kind of a bit of a service system, and it was the client-centered, like, the support, as we keep hearing about wrapping the support around the person and not expecting them to fit into a program. We've sort of been banging on about that for years. So it's difficult to hear that we're still in this place where it's just not happening. I do genuinely believe that unaccompanied children and young people have missed out for so many years in this space, and I still don't quite understand why. I don't feel like I've ever nailed the reason why that has happened, and I have been in the sector for many years and I still haven't. So anyway, I'll stop talking now. There is a few more questions there. I don't think we're going to have a huge amount of time to do those ones, because we're coming to the end of the webinar. I would like to give you, Carmel, a huge thank you for agreeing to present your research today. It's so appreciative, and so many people would have got so much out of listening to your research. Going forward, I hope we can create and mobilise more people to help us get this issue out there, to start talking about it and taking it more seriously and getting it in the domestic and family violence action plans and the standalone homelessness plan going forward. Catherine, as per usual, you're wonderful. It was amazing how you brought, talking about the intersections of homelessness has on this cohort. Again, appreciate your input And thank you so much again for participating in this discussion today. We will probably send an email out following this to all participants, just to include the research, to include Catherine Robinson's research as well, because she's put that in the chat before, and just a link to Yfoundations. This has been recorded, so we will include that as well for people who didn't get an opportunity to be here today. Again, thank you. Thank you to everyone that participated and asked questions and was just there on the webinar today. It just gives me a lot of hope that there's so many people who are really interested in this issue. Have a great Thursday, and I hopefully will see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. Look after yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.